back now, get reaction to what Rachel Reeves said in the House of Commons. I'm joined in the studio by our reporter, Adam Cherry. Adam, so a bold statement, a lengthy statement. Rachel Reeves started off by pointing out the size of the black hole increased from 20 billion this morning to 22 billion, and a phrase she kept repeating: if we cannot afford it, we cannot do it. Adam, what leapt out to you in her rather scything cuts?
Well, first of all, this is clearly a Chancellor who knows she has an enormous mandate and can do this early in the Premiership, because it's only 3 weeks since the election. So if you're going to grasp the nettle, now's the time to do it. And, I mean, blimey, there's a lot here, isn't there, as you said. So 22 billion, that's worse than was briefed out. We expected 19 to 20. Biggest headline news here is on the winter fuel payment, which is now being means tested. I mean, this is something that you would expect to see from a George Osborne. This really reminded me of the 2010 coalition government with George Osborne using similar rhetoric. If we can't afford it, we can't do it. And so there's more to come on this. So we also learned that the budget itself, when really the other part of this story is delivered, tax rises, that will come on the 30th of October. And she didn't shy away from saying, look, this is going to be a painful statement. So we did expect that, but nonetheless, I think seeing it in the Commons and seeing the energy in the room and how furious Jeremy Hunt was to see his and the former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's legacy, if you want to call it that, torn up in front of them so aggressively was really quite something. Yeah,
and she went into some detail. £5.5 billion of costs to be cut this year. Asylum support, she said there's been a 7-fold increase in that in the last 3 years. The projected overspend, 6.4 billion, but no detail of how that could be cut, because you can't cut this cost unless you start deporting people. Rail services, £1.6 billion overspend. She then went on to say £1.7 billion is what they've been haggling on the independent pay body review. But she then went on to say that she would accept the recommendations of those pay reviews. And Jeremy Hunt was quick to hit back. It's like, well, you're talking about a financial black hole, but how much of that is the money you've just given to the public sector, is projected to be £9 billion?
I thought it was really interesting, Jeremy Hunt's response you bring up there. So the line I think you'll hear from the opposition repeatedly is £24 billion spent since the election, which is roughly £1 billion a day up to this point. That's on things like GB Energy, roughly £8 billion, the public sector pay rises and other things as well. So, already they're opening up the wallet and using the credit card quite readily. And again, where does that money come from? We're going to find out in a few months' time. It was absolutely astonishing, the energy in that room. And funnily enough, she also mentioned what Paul Johnson had to say. Now, Paul Johnson is the director of the IFS, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, who before the statement said, if Rachel Reeves is going to try and justify some of these measures by saying we didn't know how bad the books were, that's not quite credible. She knew that was going to be mentioned, and she had a counter-attack ready and saying he has just tweeted in the last few moments during that speech regarding the overspend on the asylum seeker. Just dropped my pen. On the asylum seeker process, saying 6.4 billion. That does seem to be not covered in the current figures. And she referenced that to Jeremy Hunt's face. So at least she was ready for some of these attacks and had some counters to them. I thought it was quite a nimble response, actually.
Jeremy Hunt called it a fictional black hole. She then said you had the chance to say sorry and you chose to ignore that. But I think you're right. The standout thing is this winter fuel payment. It very much felt like an austerity measure, a George Osborne measure. We had Maggie Thatcher, milk snatcher, back in the day. We had the dementia tax of the Theresa May regime. All these things stuck out. £2.5 billion a year is what the winter fuel payment costs. Now it's going to be means tested. Now, is there some common sense in that? Wealthier pensioners don't get it. Is that a good idea? Or will this be along that lines of you're basically allowing old people to freeze to death? Will that be an attack line, do you think?
It's an interesting one. I think with the public, it will probably be a more palatable option than with a lot of the Labour MPs. I'd be really interested to hear, and I'll try and speak to them after this, the reaction from the Labour backbenchers. Because in the last week we've had Labour whips forcing the backbenchers to vote for a 2-child benefit cap and now for a means-tested winter fuel allowance. This is not in the traditional terms, Labour principles. So, as I say, that's only something they can do because they have such an enormous majority and they're so early in their premiership. But the pain will come further down the track.
And painful pensioners. Adam Cherry, huge amount of detail to unpack. No doubt we'll do that over the coming hours. Thank you very much for joining me in the studio.